Thank you for joining us today. We'll start in next couple of minutes. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you for joining us for the second session of Inter-Archive Conversations. And I hope that you all are keeping well and taking good care from wherever you're joining us today. I'm Nupur Desai. I'm a researcher at Asia Archive in India. And before we begin, for those of you who are less familiar with our work, Asia Art Archive is an independent not-for-profit organization that focuses on documentation and research on recent art and art histories from across Asia. Our main office is in Hong Kong, where we have a reference library with large collection of books, periodicals, and zines. We organize programs, we do exhibitions, and we come up with publications. And the materials in our office are digitized and are available online for reference. We also have an office in New Delhi, where I'm currently speaking to you from. And one of the projects that we have been working on over the last year and a half across Delhi, Hong Kong, and Kathmandu is Mobile Library Nepal. The project is a collaboration between Asia Art Archive and Siddarth Arts Foundation and is generously supported by the Foundation for Arts Initiatives. And it was officially launched in February this year. Mobile Library Nepal is a traveling library situated in Kathmandu at the moment, which circulates books on recent art from Asia within Nepal. And through a series of on-site and online programs with educators, arts universities, and independent arts organizations, the site of the library is being activated since its launch. One of the crucial areas that these programs have been reflecting on is archiving. The growing interest in the practice of archiving, as well as the initiatives in archiving that have taken shape in recent times in the region. So with Inter-Archives Conversations, the idea is to have a platform for institutions and individuals working with archives in the region to come together to share about the forms and infrastructures of their archives and how they think about their work and situate the materials in the context of the urgencies of the present. So for us, Nepal becomes a point of departure, and South Asia a context to hold these conversations, not in the strictest sense of geopolitical region, but rather as a way to think about certain shared affinities and histories to ground our concerns, or how we can share our materials and our processes with each other. How can we learn from each other? And most importantly, ask each other some critical questions. So, having said that, I now come to today's conversation. This conversation is a set of 4 inter-archives conversations as a year-long engagement organized in conjunction with the Mobile Library Nepal. And each conversation in this series is conceptualized in collaboration with an archive in Nepal based on the key concerns and interests of the archive in question. So in today's conversation, we will explore the idea of ephemera, a transient and a fluid category that exists in the archive and proves to be a conundrum for the archivist. So ephemera is material that typically meant to be in limited circulation for short periods, is not meant to be preserved. Though time-bound and with an expiry date, ephemera moves beyond its limited presence once it enters the archive. During our interactions, Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya team referred to ephemera as an archivist conundrum, an intriguing proposition which we believed was a crucial issue to reflect on. As some of you may know, Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya is the principal archive of books, periodicals, ephemera, and related collections in the Nepali language, with both physical as well as digital infrastructure. An MPP contains around 16,000 documents categorized as ephemera that range across political, social, and cultural domains. And as we collaborated on this program, the core questions that we were looking at were, why are certain kinds of material referred to as ephemera? How do we situate it within the archive? How does it inform the archive? And how do we understand ephemera in terms of its materiality, its form, and its content? So drawing on these concerns, today we will be discussing how researchers and archivists encounter ephemera. How do they engage with it? And more importantly, what less visible aspects of our histories ephemera can reveal? So I'm very happy to introduce our first speakers today, Deepak, Aryal, and Shamik Mishra. Deepak and Shamik are researchers and archivists at Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya. And in their presentation, they will explore MPP's Nepali-language ephemera collection and how it records everyday events in Nepal's recent history, while thinking about the urgencies of the present to document ephemera. Just before we begin, some housekeeping. This session will be for an hour and a half, and speakers will be presenting their work in the first 45 minutes, and then we will have a conversation, and then open up the questions from audiences at the end of the conversation. If you have questions, please type them in Zoom's Q&A feature. You can do this anytime during the talk, and we will do our best to take them up during the discussion. So without further ado, I now hand it over to Deepak and Shamik.
Hello, good evening. I'm Deepak Aryal, working as a researcher at Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya. I'll go with my reading and presentation, slide presentation. So first, I'll share PowerPoint, and I'll go with the text with presentation. My presentation will briefly introduce the ephemera collection at Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya MPP and focus around the issues of collection, production, and distribution of the mostly printed ephemera that we have. We all know how important this category of archival materials is for political and socio-cultural history, and they have been the main primary source for the history of advertisement since long. MPP has around 16,000 ephemera, including few digital photographs of ephemeral text, notice, appeals, and advertisement across in different medium, which are rare to be found in a single location. The appeal of ephemera, I think, lies in two factors: their utility in filling the gaps left by mainstream historiography that has often ignored. This design and produced for short-term materials is worthy and credible bunch of evidence. And second, the ability of ephemera to counter and even demolish prevailing dominant narratives in the society, thereby opening up a space for the voices of the marginalized and otherwise ignored. This remarkable strength of ephemera, however, does not mean that they are unquestionable class of evidence. They too have their own objectives and which have to be read and interpreted with nuance. Through the collection at MPP, I hope to raise this issue through my presentation. I will also share a few points if form and mediums impact the message of ephemera. I hope it will resonate with or with my fellow participants in this platform. Imagine a nation where the printing press controlled by the then government arrived in 1850, and in the time span of 170 years since 1850 to 2021, printing and publishing polity were guided, controlled, or obstructed by the state almost 140 years. First 100 years of Rana regime controlled all printing and publishing mechanism and did not allow printing and publishing without prior permission. The next 30 years, the Panchayat system also controlled the printing and publishing sphere, where most of the political parties were banned and anti-state or anti-government publications were almost prohibited to circulate and even printed within the state boundary. Another 10 years, during Maoist insurgency, the government carefully curbed the printing and publishing related to Maoist movement. The slide one represents three different political environments where anti-state or system voices became the part of ephemeral publications. Nonetheless, government also used and circulated various ephemeral publications along with national newspaper using state mechanism. This appeal was distributed including in the government owned national daily, the Gorkha Patra. It gives physical and facial details of the opposition leader Ganesh Singh, who had recently escaped from the prison. It gives permission to take action while capturing him, that is, use of weapon if required. Importantly, in these all political turmoils all across the time, ephemera played a crucial role to oppose the state mechanism. If so, some fundamental questions can be asked. Who were the people who printed and circulated the ephemera in this restricted political environment? How and where they printed it and circulated it? Were all political ephemera were in printed form? Did they use handwritten poster and pamphlets? A final question may be, if people were writing, printing, and circulating the ephemera, then why and how was it different from the other printed materials or source of information? How different were they from periodicals and monographs? Were they really generating and providing different information, messages, or stories? How this medium was different? How the state or pro-state people were opposing the non-state propaganda or vice versa? If the whole nation were under the control of government and the government did not allow to print and circulate such materials, how they got access to print, where they went to print, who were the people, and how they circulated it. If we assume that the ephemeras mostly cover the anti-government messages or speak the voices of common people, those who do not have access to print, book, or radio, then it might be wrong in some cases. So we can assume that both groups, state or non-state, were powerful and influential enough, and they were very well aware about the power and significance of the medium for political campaign. It challenged the idea of political ephemera that normally comes from opposition non-state actors who has less access to various media. I elaborate more. First, the people who could go to Banaras or Kolkata for history or to print political pamphlets poster from Nepal must be more privileged than illiterate or barely illiterate citizenry. Second, the government was equally using this tool to oppose the opposition or to communicate their own notice and information. One example, in 1950s, an airplane, Himalayan Airways, one of the first private airlines companies in the subcontinent, owned by Mahavir Shamsher, dropped political appeal ephemera over Kathmandu. The same plane also circulated other political pamphlet again after 2 weeks. In addition, the Rana government responded to it by circulating their own counter-narrative pamphlets, also using the airplane around the same time. Third, the production and consumption of long and dense text in ephemeral materials also need a good writing and reading skill. Fourth, writing, printing, circulating, and consuming were not the easy process and practices where only 5% population were literate until 1950s. Five, every appeal, notice, information, or commercial advertisement has its own audience or consumer. In the form, design, or text of ephemera may be different according to their audience. Therefore, it can be treated as segmented and fragmented source of information that can connect or thread, or can be connected with other thread. Of course, there were not only political parties, pamphlets, and posters in this collection. Then, what were they? How MPP collected it? Is there any specific thread where we can connect all ephemeral materials collection collected and preserved at MPP? Yes, at least for MPP it was N is Nepali language. Slide 5, this is. Uh, in this slide, there are 4 posters which are produced in Darjeeling, Gorakhpur. Gorakhpur, it is in Hindi, but related to the Nepali Prime Minister Juddha Shamsher and his donation for a school in Gorakhpur, for Kalimpong, and for Banaras. These were produced and distributed in different locations, but the collector collected and preserved it because of the language. Now, it is difficult to connect these dots because of location, time, period, and objectives of the production. But it is possible to connect with other archived and untold stories of that time. MPP holds such items from different geographical locations such as Bhutan, Myanmar, Patna, Delhi, Mumbai, Sikkim, Assam, Dehradun, and other places where Nepali speaking population produce it. In this slide, 3 materials of the first row are related to political campaigning, where the text can be seen in the medium of paper, wall, and clothes. While comparing the medium, perhaps some are more ephemeral than others. Here, paper or clothes with masses can be collected or preserved to some extent, but wall painting or graffiti can only be remembered by conversion to another medium. We have to think carefully if the masses actually change the medium or medium change the masses. In the second row, 3 texts are printed in paper. First one was printed and distributed in Kanpur, India. Second one is an appeal that opposed government-run Radio Nepal's information. And third one is printed in paper but posted on wall. However, the fourth one is a hoarding board that shows the taxi fare of Kathmandu Valley. Uh, this slide shows the various masses printed in paper and clothes. First row represents the national issue, but the second row comes from Gulmi, Chiton, Palpa, and Kaspi district, different parts of Nepal. This type of ephemera normally talks about the local issue, which may or may not be the part of national discourse. In this slide, few color papers represent the ideology of masses. It gives the idea of state and opposition. It gives the idea of particular concept and ideology. The color text that gives message, and we can understand it without a single letter. Without reading, we understand it. First row represents the symbol and photographs rather text. Uh, However, the characteristics of the voting board and the text in a wall are different. Never, nevertheless, nevertheless, the election ballot paper contains symbols which are more easy to understand in some contexts. In the second row, the blue color text represents the anti-panchayat symbol, while yellow paper represents the pro-panchayat symbol. In the referendum held in 1980, the Election Commission had allocated the yellow to Panchayat system and blue symbol to anti-Panchayat opposition group. So most of political content during the 1980s referendum appeared in two particular colors. The colors of paper or the text itself was a symbol of representation that communicated to audience without letter. It also represents the variety of ephemeral materials which are either in clothes, wall, or paper. On the other hand, they may be in different color, text, or shape. Among the popular ephemeral materials, normally pamphlet is in small size and the texts are small. The main purpose of pamphlets is to inform people in detail, but posters are broad in size and texts are bigger. It may be hung or glued in public places for mass consumption. But most of the ephemera produced and advertised for modern commercial product collected at MPP don't justify that statement. This is a hagiographical text printed in paper. The text praised the work of Jyoti Shamsher, who actively and smoothly handled the post-earthquake situation of 1934. The text is on one side of paper and in poetic meters. It is not clear whether it was posted on the city walls or only distributed to audience who could read and recite poetry. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, it seems neither poster nor pamphlet as we categorize.
Sorry to
The,
interrupt you, Deepak, but you
yes,
have 2 more minutes.
yes,
You have 2 more minutes.
yes,
I'm
sure.
just aware of
I'll
time, so
almost,
yeah.
yeah, okay, I'll try to complete. The early printed ephemera are mostly blank in one side. That helps to glue or hang in public place, but the texts are too small and long to read, so audience must watch and read it from near distance. Therefore, we have to think about text form, layout, and purpose of text rather than size and standard definition and characteristics of poster or pamphlets. Final slide. In 1910, one text-based advertisement of book was printed and circulated in Kathmandu. The size of paper is 48 by 28 centimeter. There are 92 lines of poem that gives information regarding a single book, which was published in 1908. The advertisement describes the importance of books, its layout, design, color of paper, covers, praise, publishers, prices, etc. Uh, so such type of materials creates puzzle while defining its form or characters. In case of Nepal, the layout and design of earlier ephemera suggests their target audience is the highly literate classes of the time of the time is these materials appear text heavy. This attribute could also be due to the limitation of the existing printing and reproduction technology. The layout and design of later political ephemera suggest that they were produced for a wider audience with brief and direct message. Here, I would like to pursue an idea from Gyanendra Pandey on archive and talks about the MPP collection. Our founding president, the late Kamal Dixit, archived ephemera because it is in the Nepali language, and he believed in their archival value. Then what did we miss or unarchived? We normally remember and talk what we see and forget to talk what we don't. So the term trifling used by Pandey is also important while thinking about the archive materials and doing archives. The MPP collects material published in the Nepali language from different parts of South Asia and other parts of the world. Uh, but miss the material produced and circulated within Nepal. If there is no geographical region, but the language is the criterion of collection, then there must be much more things which are not archived and that can tell different stories even in same subject or same location. So we must think about other unspoken, unwritten, and unarchived things along with ephemera as well as with monographs and periodicals. In these circumstances, can we even rethink about the form and nature of particular ephemera published and distributed in South Asia? I think we cannot differentiate the idea of poster and pamphlets that were used in the Nepali context before the arrival of popular commercial sector or international practice of design and production of ephemeral masses. Most of the ephemera at MPP were like long articles or long reading texts. Therefore, the form of the text, design, and layout seem more appropriate to read, taking long time like an article of a newspaper. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you so much for sharing that fascinating material from the archive and taking us through the political history of Nepal. So from the political, we now move towards the cultural aspect of the city. And for that, our next speaker is Ritwika Mishra. Ritwika has worked as assistant archivist from 2016 to 2020 at the Visual Archive of Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, CSSC, that hosts a body of pictorial and photographic genres from Bengal from the mid-19th to early 20th century. And today, Ritwika will speak about art of advertising and product publicities in Kolkata from the early and mid-20th century, while thinking about the idea of ephemera as a way of visualizing the social and cultural lives of the city. Over to you, Ritwika.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll share my screen first. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Ritwika. As Nupur mentioned, I used to work for the past 4 years in the Visual Archives of CSSC, and I'll take you through the various elements of ephemera that is part of the archival collection. To begin my presentation today, I will start with what you see on your screen right now, which is a page of a calendar from 1969, produced for a printing company in Calcutta. It was designed by Raghunath Goswami, one of the commercial artists. Now, this is one example of the many categories of objects that can be interpreted as ephemera. Coming to the well-known definition of ephemera by Chris Makepeace in his book, Ephemera, a book on its collection, conservation, and use. He characterizes ephemera as a material which is usually flimsy or insubstantial, a transient document produced for a specific purpose, and the longevity of it is bound by that use and time period. Which means, sorry, I think my slide is not moving. Samira, can you share my slide, please? Thanks. So, talking about ephemera, as you can see on the right-hand side, I've laid down few of the points and categories around which I'll have today's presentation bound around. So, which means the calendar page on the previous slide or this advertisement that you see on your left-hand side, this was not originally meant to be viewed now in 2021, owing to its materiality being printed on a newspaper or a booklet, and also it was destined to be discarded after its use. But my points and few questions that I will raise in the course of the presentation is, what happens to such materials once it enters the space of the archive, and does the archive, by the process of it and the space of the archive, attribute a certain sense of permanence to these. Next slide. In today's presentation, I will show you some examples of the collection of ephemera from the visual archives of CSSC and try to demonstrate how the varying kinds of ephemeral objects define the idea of ephemerality and the relation of these materials to the site and the process of archiving. Now, to introduce the CSSC archives is important to contextualize the collection of ephemera with the larger catalog and the collection of the visual archives. Now, named after the social and cultural historian Hitesh Ranjan Shanal, CSSC's archives began in 1993 with the project of microfilming various 19th century and early 20th century Bengali periodicals. The visual archives began its journey slightly later, after 3 years in 1996, with the goal of documenting, cataloging, and bringing together the pictorial, print, and photographic materials of the late 19th and early 20th century that remain scattered across various holdings of private collectors, families of artists, even in printing units, factories, newspaper offices, and various private trusts. From 1993, there has been numerous initiatives spearheaded by various faculty members or experts who have generously headed collecting endeavors based on specific interests and projects. But what I choose and the 4 categories in front of you are very specifically chosen because and for the reason of the discussion today and the cause of the discussion. It is crucial also to note that CSSC is largely and substantially a digital archive. A lot of materials, the visual archives has about over 40,000 images which are digitized. And also there are few of the materials which are kind of have a physical representation in their original forms. But again, archiving being, it's kind of an infinite process of collecting ephemera, but archive as a space is a finite space and it can only accommodate up to a certain kind of material elements. Usually the processes that goes about in terms of acquiring the materials and archiving them is usually the institution documents the collections with help of microfiche, microfilms, slides, transparencies. Recently, of course, with the emergence of the digital high-res scan facilities, most of the copies are kept in digital files. While in most cases, because we act as a custodian or the CSSC acts as a custodian, the owners get to keep the originals. However, there have been cases where people have handed their collections for safekeeping and have donated or gifted to the institution. The next slide, please. The collection of ephemera that I'm going to show you and talk about stems for and resides within this larger collection of visual materials. Right now, what you see in front of you is 2 pages. One is from an early newspaper periodical. Left-hand side is a newspaper called Jugantar. It's a 1942 issue, the first page. And right-hand side, you can see it's one of the Puja special edition of Amrita Bajar magazine. Now, the most of the materials that you will see and the collection that CSSC has focuses on Bengal and the larger eastern region. So the materials that you will see mostly will be in Bengali, but coming to the nature of ephemera and publicity materials, because of its circulation and the nature of the circulation that demands, there will be translations, there will be copies of English, which will be probably interest the larger audience to read. I will go over the next section, and it will be in certain clusters based on 3 or 4 specific collection. And the reason I've picked up those clusters is to demonstrate certain elements which informs the archive and also how the archive informs ephemera and the story of the commercial art and advertising in Calcutta. Next slide. Coming to one of the most substantial collection of the ephemera in CSSC is the Porimal Rai collection. Porimal Rai, right now he's like an over like 80 plus person living in Calcutta. He has lived and worked in Calcutta all through. He is not one of those collectors that who will only collect precious objects. I mean, he did. But also one of the most important contributors who kind of brought in and rendered value to ephemera by collecting it, by sheer practice of collecting it. We did a lot of interviews with him over a period of time. And here what was important is you can look at a certain material, but once you engage it with the role of the collector, the material speaks differently to you because you know the impulse of the collector, why and how and what made him to collect this. So Porimal Rai is one such person who had this bug of collecting ephemera since he was quite young. I mean, he would narrate to us stories when he would he would take off film posters from walls and hide it under his bed. And of course, the families, he was young back then, and the families will not approve of that, and they will take it out and burn. But over the years, you can see the two pictures. One of it, I think these were taken in 2020 when Professor Gotakurta and me, we had gone to his residence to interview him. And as you can see in both the pictures, the walls behind and in the left hand side picture and the right hand side, the narrow veranda, it's kind of filled and cramped with various objects. Like boards, signages, old oleograph prints and all of those. But unfortunately, this is like probably 10 or 20% of what actually and originally he collected, because the lack of space, because he's an individual and he has to run and collect everything by himself. So he has generously contributed and shared a lot of his collections with the CSSC archives and led to the growth of the archives in terms of ephemera. Next slide, please. So coming to the cinema booklets. Now the next 3 slides will show the key elements of the collection from Porimal Rai, and which he has generously donated to us. The first 2 images in here is, of course, 2 film booklets. The first one to your left is a Chaurangi, which was a Bengali film that came out in 1968. It was kind of those multi-starrer films. And the right hand side is Pothed Dabi. Pothed Dabi originally is a novel by Sharat Chandra, which was kind of made into a film. Now, film booklets were made. I mean, if you can see the creatively, it's so well thought out, well designed. But these were also meant to be short-lived. It meant to be circulated amongst a few select people, select crowds who would go to the films. They would have so these were like maybe 4 to 10 pages, depending on the cast, on the story, and would have every detail of the films. The next slide, please. The second crucial collection is the Matchbox labels by Porimal Rai. I have chosen these 2 because these kind of shows the creative investment in designing of these kind of labels on matchboxes, which kind of gives you a really minuscule amount of canvas to think and design. And matchboxes in itself, matchbox labels in itself and matchboxes have a very interesting history in terms of circulation, being produced by foreign companies and then being produced by Indian companies also to counter, especially during the Swadeshi movement. So these collection of matchbox labels kind of give a very interesting history of the other side of the commercial aspects of probably the Swadeshi movement also. And what is interesting is how images from Ravi Verma prints make appearance on the matchbox labels. Next slide, please. Now, one of the star pieces or the most interesting kind of collection from Porimal Roy and the digital copies of which survive in our archives is the animal signboards. The street hoardings of the signboards is kind of one of the most unique collections because they kind of preserve or rather represent the most unique but extinct art of animal board signboard paintings. These were called kind of street jewelry because at one point of time the streets, and if you go back to old photographs, you'll see like streets were full of these signages in railways, in shops, everywhere had this different kinds of animal board signages. What was interesting is these all will be discarded because these were made of iron and often will be taken away to the shop where the animals were being scraped off and the iron will just be sold. The archive right now preserves few of one or two of in the original form, but most of it is kind of the only repository perhaps of these dispersed collections. Next slide, please. Moving on from Porimal Roy's collection, and before I jump into this section, which is the Masters of Commercial Design, I would like to point out here like how we see ephemera in the previous kind of collection. How I would like to point out here was like Porimal Roy as a collector himself rendered certain value by collecting these posters or matchbox labels or signboards, which probably were meant to be kind of discarded and trashed. Um, and but in this case, of the 5 commercial artists or artists of whose work I'll showcase and speak about, this collection came to us through various sources and mostly by the families of the artists who had their work with them preserved like posthumously and have donated or shared. Mostly they have been shared and digital copies of those have been made and it has been returned. Next slide, please. I'll start with Onoda Munshi. He was one of the senior most of the rest of this pool of commercial artists. Now, what is interesting is you can see all of these are advertisements for cotton mills in Surat, Bombay, elsewhere, and you can see this is a periodical cover of a magazine. Now, all of these are considered to be kind of discarded after certain news. And but what is interesting, like even though the materials like product labels, signages, matchboxes, packing boxes, posters, they were meant to be of transient nature with a limited shelf life. The art of designing these materials were the works of very specialized professionals. Next slide, please.
I hate to interrupt, Ritwika, but you have 2 more minutes.
Okay. I'll just quickly then if you go to the 13th and 14th. This is by Sapitri and Raghunath Goswami. This is the 15th slide. Thank you. So even the materials like these were being heavily drawn and invested. Commercial art as a category emerges around 20th century and it finds a formal recognition when around in late 1940s, the Government School of Art in Calcutta establishes a department called Commercial Art Department. The next 2 sections will be showcasing these 2 journals called Art and Industry and Sundaram that you will find later. Now, what is interesting, the next slide, please. What is interesting is like these journals were not only encouraging the artists and professionals, because by the time the Calcutta School of the Government School of Art had a commercial department, it meant that it kind of brought together skills of traditional craftsmanship. They would get trained in the college and they would be inducted into a larger professional life. The commercial art therefore became a very lucrative vocation for artists and blockmakers and painters. The next slide, please. And these magazines would carry widespread kind of double-paged works of colorful works of the artists. Next slide, please. This is the other periodicals in Bangla by Shubho Tagore that was being edited, called Sundaram. Next slide, please. And companies like Dunlop and Burma Shell were also kind of investing in bringing out these journals, rather like sponsoring them. Like Sundaram was heavily sponsored by Dunlop. The next slide. And it would also have not only works of commercial artists, but people writing on the commercial aspect of it, the commercial artwork. What I want to like close this conversation by saying, like the collection as C archives and the form of the collection itself embodies a transition, the passage from something which is extremely fragile yet public to the private holdings of collectors, to the time when these enter the physical and the virtual domains of archives. Maybe these ephemeras have an afterlife in the archives in forms of, high-res scans or TIFF files, but at the core, the archive by the endeavor kind of looks to expand the scope, to redefine what is ephemeral and what is not. Like by including what was meant to be discarded and short-lived, it kind of prods to render value and attention to the world of materials and voices that are often denied so. So like there are a number of skilled block makers, printmakers, artists, we kind of encounter their work, but there has been no documentation or no kind of recognition. So probably ephemeras will prod us to think along those lines. So thank you.
Thank you, Ritwika, for taking us through the history of the city. We have various ephemera collections from CSSC's archive and its different forms. We move on to our last panelist today, Siddarth Ganesh. Siddarth Ganesh is a queer historian based in Bangalore and have been working with cataloging, transcribing, translating material at the Queer Archive of Memory, Reflection and Activism, CAMRA. CAMRA is a physical multimedia archival effort which aims to chronicle the genesis and growth of the struggle for the rights of sexuality and gender minorities in India. In this presentation, they will look at the personal ephemera of intimate memories surrounding the evolution of queer activism in Bangalore within the larger context of the LGBTQ movement in India. Over to you, Siddarth.
Hi, I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen. Okay, is this visible for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I am Siddarth from the Queer Archive for Memory, Reflection and Activism, or CAMRA, in Bangalore. While preparing for today's presentation, the first question that came to my mind was, what makes ephemera ephemeral? And one way of answering this question is by looking at the material's intrinsic value. And here I was going to quote Chris Makepeace from the same book, but Ritwika already did. In short, what makes ephemera ephemeral is their limited life. They are meant to be destroyed through and after use. But once the ephemera enter the archive, the intent is to preserve them for as long as the archive endures, making ephemera permanent. So the question then became, what other things make ephemera ephemeral? Or what is ephemeral in the archive? In today's presentation, I'm going to show you some of the ephemera we have at CAMRA and illustrate instances of ephemerality. To explain what I mean by ephemera versus the ephemeral, I'm going to take the following example. What you see on the screen right now, both sets of materials are poetry written by A. Revati, the celebrated trans activist and actor. On the left side, you will see her poetry, which has been published as ephemera, as a pamphlet. And on the right side is what I recognize as an ephemeral manifestation of Revati's poesy. Before Revati was the famous activist she is today, at a meeting somewhere in Bangalore, she hastily tore a sheet of paper in two and started scribbling lines of poetry on it. If you notice here in the beginning, there is a lot of space between the alphabets and the words. But as her lines grow longer and more complicated, the gaps vanish and she struggles to finish the line in the short space of the sheet. What makes this ephemeral is not the water damage that the paper has undergone before it came to the archive, or that it continues to deteriorate in the archive, but that this captures a brief moment of Revati's relationship with her poesy, something that we can experience in its ephemerality in her handwritten format, but which disappears when it's published in print as ephemera. At Kamra, we have various kinds of ephemera, from brochures, pamphlets, stickers, invitation cards, minutes of meetings, press releases. The list is long. I broadly divide the ephemera we have into two categories: ephemera at Kamra and ephemera of Kamra. Ephemera at Kamra is the ephemera we have received from donors, which create our collections at the archive. And the ephemera of Kamra is the ephemera that has been collected during the journey of setting up the archive itself. Kamra is a multilingual queer archive with material primarily in Kannada, English, Tamil, Malayalam, and Hindi about the crystallization of the gay movement or the queer movement in Bangalore and in India. But the ephemera we have broadens the geographical and the linguistic range much further. I will begin to show you some of the ephemera at Kamra with this brochure. This is a brochure in Romanian from Romania about the first national level NGO set up to protect and fight for LGBT rights. Now, this is part of the ephemera received from Sangama, which is a human rights organization based in Bangalore, which works with working class queer communities. How this brochure came all the way from Romania to Bangalore still remains a mystery to us, but it exists in our collection. Journey is a newsletter from Sri Lanka of a group called Companions on a Journey. The first page is the only page that is in English. The rest are in Sinhalese and in Tamil. And they record the experience of organizing the first AIDS conference in Sri Lanka. When You Say Yes by the Victorian AIDS Council is a report from the Victorian AIDS Council in Australia about their experiences of managing a queer awareness and STD and HIV awareness campaign in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s. These two pamphlets are from Seattle in the US, one about abortion rights and the other about the Stonewall Committee. I think every queer movement at some point or other references the Stonewall riots in their politics. What you see on the screen now are AIDS awareness pamphlets in 4 different Indian languages. The first one is in Urdu, this is in Gujarati, then in Bengali, and in Punjabi. But what is interesting about these AIDS awareness pamphlets is that they were not made in India, nor were they distributed in India. They were made by a group called the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention in Toronto, Canada, and were circulated among South Asians living in Canada. AIDS ephemera creates a significant part of the ephemera collection in Kamra. Now, this is a booklet, Introduction to Complementary Therapies on Managing and Treating AIDS, completely in Tamil, again from Canada. When a Friend Has AIDS is a brochure on how to react and what to talk about and how to help your friend if they tell you that they have AIDS. And these 2 brochures are from Berlin in Germany. This one reads, My Kid is HIV Infected, and this one reads, In Terms of Love, for girls with HIV. And these 2 brochures tell you how to have the difficult and awkward conversations if your child, your partner, or you have HIV/AIDS, how to bring it up. A part of our AIDS ephemera is also material from India. Positive Voice was a newsletter for the Indian Network for People Living with HIV and AIDS. This is another AIDS awareness brochure. Now, AIDS awareness brochures across national boundaries consistently have similar kinds of material. What is HIV? What is AIDS? What are the modes of transmission? How does one protect themselves from it? And where and how to seek aid? But this brochure from the Manipur Voluntary Health Organization prioritizes needle sharing as the primary mode of HIV transmission. This reveals that in the region that they operated, intravenous drug usage was at a high prevalence. And thus they needed to prioritize this as the information that needed to be shared. Now, the AIDS ephemera that we have provide unique perspectives and thought processes behind AIDS activism, about what people thought was important that the public knew. And this pamphlet in front of you is from Bangalore, published by a group called Samraksha in Canada. And it is about the sanitary measures to be taken when you are working with the body of somebody who has died from AIDS. Across the Indian and international material, this was a pamphlet that struck me as revealing information that nobody else had thought about. This points to the fact that access to information was a crucial aspect to AIDS awareness. Moving on from AIDS ephemera, the other ephemera that we have at the archive characterizes Kamra as an archive of protests, capturing an intimate memory of the social movements and protests in the 90s and 80s. The three pamphlets you see on the screen now are bilingual. On one side, they have English text, and on the other, the same text in Kannada, made by the women's group Vimochana in Bangalore. They show you a wide range of issues that they had close to their activism: against nuclear armament, which is through remembering Hiroshima and remembering the Hibakusha. Banwari Bai was a woman of lower caste from Rajasthan who in 1991, if I'm not mistaken, or 92, was gang raped. And over the course of the next few years, miscarriage of justice was carried out against her, where she was denied any justice by the courts and the government. And this, the text in Kannada, is about bride burning for dowry. We have various other social movements covered as well: an appeal from the people of Tibet, and about the Dalai Lama's 5-point peace plan for the future of Tibet, Bangalore platform against nuclear weaponization, and a report by Workers' Solidarity in Delhi about the injustices faced by contract laborers employed in the Delhi airport. Water Politics is a news magazine of the National Alliance of People's Movements, which unveils corruption in the water management sector by both the state agencies and private agencies across the world. And Seeds of Protest is a book from 1993 about how soon after the economic liberalization of India, the foreign MNCs that invaded the country sought to gain monopoly over seed banks and who had the right to work with seeds and sell seeds to our farmers. As an archive of protest, we are also an archive of the South Asian queer diaspora. Shakti Khabar is a newsletter of the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Network from the USA, and Khush Khayal is a newsletter of the Khush group from Canada. They speak about the experiences of South Asians living in these specific countries, living their lives as queer people of color in predominantly white countries. Now, to look at the ephemera of Kamra. This set of material is from the Interference Archive in Brooklyn, who have been involved with our journey right from the get-go. The postcard you see on the left of the screen is from the Spinboden Lesbian Archives in Germany, which was picked up at the ARMS conference in Berlin in 2019, of which Kamra was a part of. The material in the middle is from Gala, the Gay and Lesbian Archives in South Africa, who have been dialoguing with us as well. And the last item towards the right, the photographs of Ziba Siddiqui, is from an exhibition at the archives of NCBS in Bangalore, and the archives at NCBS have helped us in figuring out our archival politics over the years as well. This, this is a sticker from the Chair in Transgender Studies and Archives from the University of Victoria, which categorically is an ephemera. But it comes with the warning, do not destroy. This material is not junk, it has historical value. I found this very interesting. But to speak a little bit more on the ephemerality in the archive and ephemerality in general, one can say that queer lives themselves are very ephemeral. Historically, they have left behind very few traces of themselves. As a queer archive, we seek to humanize history. What this means is that all our archival records, we do not look at them as just objects, but as containers of memory, as memories that can be experienced as an affective moment by anybody who comes to interact with them. So how do we preserve an affective moment in final arrangement? How do we present it to a user? So what you see now is a program or synopsis booklet from the 19th Paris International Lesbian and Feminist Film Festival in 2007. I found this booklet in our collection and I was wondering why we had it. As I was flipping through the pages, a card fell out of it, the card you see here on the right. On closer inspection, I found that it was a thank you card from one of the organizers addressed to Tijashri, whose documentary, Many People, Many Desires, had been screened at the film festival. This documentary is about the queer groups in Bangalore. Now, what was interesting about this encounter was not just the moment of discovery I had gone through, but also Jayashree's relationship with the material itself, in which she had not kept the card separately or as a separate element, but had put the card inside it. This creates an ephemeral moment, an ephemeral and a brief relationship with the material that can be experienced. And thus, in presenting it, I put the card back into the booklet and I have catalogued them not as two separate elements, but as one being inside the other to allow any users the same moments of affective experiences. I would also like to, I would also like to present to you two other moments of archival ephemerality as I have come across them at Kamra. On the left, we see a poster or a pamphlet for a protest planned in Bangalore. This was a protest to protest against this new rule that the Bangalore City Corporation wanted to institute, which would make Cubbon Park and Lal Bagh, the two big public parks of the city, inaccessible to a vast majority of people. They planned to institute a rule where only people who had paid for a membership and had an ID card could enter the parks. Now, this is a gross injustice to many working class queer people who have had access, free access to these parks and have used the premises for many, many decades. So when the organizers of this protest sent this pamphlet to Sangama, which works primarily with working class queer people, of course, wanted to go support the protest. So somebody who worked at Sangama at that point wrote on the poster, Sangama, all staff, go to the protest. What this shows is not just that a protest was happening at Bangalore at a particular point in time, but also a person and an organization's relationship to this protest, why it was important to them. And that is, yet again, a kind of ephemeral experience that archival records allow us to experience. But the problem that I have encountered with ephemera is that one of dating. If you look at the pamphlet / poster down here, you will see that the date and the time has been mentioned, but the year hasn't been mentioned. And this is a common occurrence across ephemeral materials, allowing us to not accurately date where and when the materials came from. The last example of ephemerality in Kamra is not even directly related to ephemera. This is from Sangama's documentation project. Over the course of 20 years, Sangama was in charge of a documentation project where they clipped out articles from newspapers, magazines, periodicals, etc., and pasted them onto sheets of paper to record information on various subjects. Often they used paper that had already been used on one side. So behind these newspaper clippings on the sheet that they were pasted on, you can find various interesting things, from bills to reports to questionnaires to something like this. So this is a sheet of paper on which somebody has handwritten number 4, why was Anita excited? And the answer to that is Anita was excited because her mother had pocket delicious lunch for her. Now, we don't know if this was a child practicing their homework or a child doing their homework, or if it was an adult learning and practicing English for the first time. But when I saw and read this for the first time, and I'm sure when you saw it right now, you felt something. And the feeling of something is the affective moment that I have been talking about so far. This is the power that archival records have to make the person who interacts with them live a feeling, a sentiment, a memory, a time, not their own, of somebody else. But they have the immense power to translate those experiences from one person to another. In conclusion, I would like to say that the crux of the archive is in its relationship to memory. What do we forget? What do we remember? But ephemera and the ephemeral encourage us to rethink these paradigms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siddarth. And thank you, all of you, for sharing your thought-provoking propositions around the idea of ephemera, and also for taking us through a wide variety of materials that one can define as ephemera. And through archive, I think we are also thinking about in relation with time and history, and how history kind of gets divided into what you find on the library shelves or in boxes in the archive, and what is meant to be discarded and thrown away. And so in the context of our conversation, I think we're also thinking about the ways in which one brings in certain materials into the fold of an archive as ephemera. And we saw different kinds of images and materials: hoardings, banners, pamphlets, advertisements, posters, periodicals. And we are also looking at this idea of ephemera from institutional as well as non-institutional context. And I was wondering how you all are thinking about the methodologies of archiving ephemera, and what were the strategies that were developed to build ephemera sections in your respective collections. Ritwika briefly touched upon in her presentation about it. But I was also kind of curious to know from Siddarth, Shamik, and Deepak, and also Ritwika, if you could elaborate on that, whether it's moving from the physical to the digital in case of MPP and CSSC, or also grounding it within the physicality of the material in case of camera, but also capturing, as Siddarth pointed out, the affective moment. So I'm interested in understanding the creative documentation strategies for ephemera from your own experiences. Maybe Deepak and Shamik, you could start. And
Thanks, Nupur. Thanks, Deepak and Ritwika and Siddarth, for your very interesting presentations. In fact, a lot of issues that we do resonate. For example, when Siddarth mentioned about the date issue, one of the major challenges that we have while archiving ephemera is how to contextualize it accurately. That is a very serious issue as well. More often than not, the day and month is mentioned, but the year is not. And when these dates are mentioned, the issuing authority or party that is not named. In our archive, we have ephemera that will simply say, let's go to the, let's join the protest rally on this date. And then it will only mention either it is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or the date and the day and the month, but not the year. And we don't know who issued it. We don't know why it was issued. We don't know what is the protest about. So there is chance that if you make an error, then you can attribute it to just about any political party or social group. You know, it can be appropriated, usurped, and written about in any which way you like. So these are, and then that's where domain expertise comes. And one of the major challenges is that, for example, in the collection, mixed collection that we have, one requires to be an election expert, an expert in the political history of Nepal, and expert in advertisement history and whatnot. but that is difficult to achieve. Uh, so that is something I'm sure we've all encountered. This is also one of the queries I think raised by Michelle. So if this also touches on what she has asked, one is that. And adding on to Michelle's query, what I'd like to say is that I find it a conundrum, not only in terms of the how we collect and preserve it and give it back, but also, for example, there are ebbs and flows in the public's interest in ephemera. So ephemera have been in existence since quite long, and there have been ephemera societies, in different parts of the world. So even if we only talk about printed ephemera, it has been around for several hundred years. So people have been collecting. So there have been eccentrics like Porimal Ray that Ritwika talked about, and there are such Porimal Rays in every city and in every village across the globe. So people have been collecting about it, but it is only during certain um, occasions that they are referred to, or there is an interest in ephemera. So I'm very happy that uh, Asia Art Archive is taking interest in ephemera as part of their uh, focus on art history. So I wonder, what are the socio-political issues, socio-political conditions, or cultural conditions that create a buzz for ephemera? Because we are neither the first nor the last people to be, working on ephemera. So that is something. For example, um, our institution, Madan Puraskar Pustakalaya, has organized exhibitions related to election, election-related ephemera on several occasions on the build-up to elections in the country. So whenever we do that, all of a sudden people, we have a good footfall because people can connect to it, and they find it very impressive that nothing has changed in the political, election manifestos of the people of the political parties since 1950s. Hardly anything substantial has changed. So they find it very interesting. So that gets written about in the newspapers, and off they go. Then there's no interest. Just like we have other issues like, the issues of social justice, human rights. So, these ephemera are also very much crucial to those topics, as Siddharth highlighted only too well, because often these are the only evidences that provide um, some information about what actually happened, how were things. Otherwise, you will not find many things in the official records. So my query, I mean, I very much have this common issue regarding, contextualizing metadata. So it is very important because if we are, then, one can interpret it anyway, one. And second is why there are certain ebbs and flows, and what socio-cultural conditions um, push people towards, valuing ephemera, because they are not that new a phenomenon themselves. Thank you.
Yeah. Siddarth, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, my interaction with ephemera has been more than just my time in Kamra as well. while I was researching for my master's dissertation, which is on the history of queer activism in Bangalore. I was looking for details, right? And ephemera were the source that provided me with the most details. Well, ironically, now that I've also said that, you know, they don't have the year in which things happened. But ephemera do kind of like plug into a hole of missing data that you don't find in these accounts of articles written about an organization, for example. You know, there was this group called Sabram, and not a lot has been written about them, but everybody has written about what kind of politics they were involved in and things like that. But the only evidence of what events they organized, who they hosted for these talks, lies in the ephemera that we find in the archive and in other places. So ephemera play a very important role in preserving memory of some sort. But I think the issue of context is also very relevant here, because some function as personal ephemera that might record something that is pertinent to some individual in particular, but some play a larger role for socio-political change, for an institution, for an organization, and things like that. My other project that involved ephemera was, as a student in France, I was researching posters of the 69 student revolution that happened in 1969 in France. And so what has happened to those posters since then? Where have they gone, for example? So it was very interesting to find that they have entered museums across the world, from America to Spain, to Germany, to, you know, Australia, some in Japan. But it's not, they might not be in the public memory anymore. The student revolts of 1969 might not be talked about anymore, but they are remembered through the ephemera, through the imagery used on these posters, through the slogans present on those posters. But another problem, though, with ephemera, especially with these newer material, even though we're a physical archive and we digitize on a need as per needed basis, when we have had to scan certain ephemeral materials, especially like pamphlets and brochures that come with like a glossy surface, the scanner's light tends to reflect off of it really badly. No matter how you position it, how you do whatever you do. So, I mean, how do you go about digitizing something with a shiny surface?
Yeah, Ritwika, would you like to take that question?
Yeah. Also, starting from like where I have engaged with, from the time I've engaged with this kind of materials, of course, it starts with CSSC, but also goes back to my graduation days, being someone who was trained in history and had an interest in visual arts. So you would back then see an ephemeral material only as to probably represent a point that you're trying to make. Just like the sheer representative quality of that image, not even going into what the context lies. But what I would also like to point out, what Deepak mentioned and Shamik also mentioned, and Siddarth continued on that, is yeah, the ephemeras kind of help us to kind of do the stitching of the broader narrative, where we kind of miss the smaller kind of accounts and details. But often, more than not, in my personal experience of working in the archive, especially with this kind of collection, is the issue of the date, assigning a date for the metadata, for the catalog, is an issue. And for that, we all like often kind of go backwards as well. Like we try to read up on the literature, writings, like oral history. Oral history has been a really big kind of growing archives for this project. Because not many of the people who used to kind of work in those generations, specifically I'm talking about the commercial art, kind of survive. But we kind of traced back the like peers, colleagues, young trainee advertisement people or commercial artists who kind of worked with them, and it really kind of marries that entire story together. Or even like there are like small probably letters that each other has written, or the interdepartmental, like the ad agencies interdepartmental correspondences. Those kind of help us to go back and kind of give a more holistic shape to this kind of materials. Also, what was interesting is not only of the final product that we see as ephemera, the poster or the packaging box or the pamphlets, everything, but also while they are in production, those in between processes, those in between products that are being generated, maybe it's not being out in the public domain, those are also extremely transient, because we have visited many like many units of commercial art, printing, even like big advertising agencies, where they had something which was called the guard books. And because back in those days everything was being done manually, and before the ad was being finalized, everything was kind of pasted in this big fat scrapbooks, and those were like really treasure troves, because a lot of those ads never saw the light of the day. But even when we try to dug up those, the companies themselves have kind of discarded them, and they have no clue of how to and what is the archival value of it. So I think in terms of plugging piece, using ephemera to plug in the larger narrative, I think at times we also need to work backwards and go back to secondary sources, oral archives, oral history. Uh, I would like to point here, I was also part of a project as a research assistant that was looking into building a archive for publicity history in India. Post-Nehruvian period, and during that was one of the moments, key points, where we kind of came to understand how these supporting materials, which kind of informs the main material you're looking at. Coming to the question, like rather the problem Siddarth talked about, yes, that is something I think while working in an archives, which is like majorly a digital archives, we have faced. And honestly, one of the way or hack people have found through is probably getting a kind of a tea stand or a tripod and using a camera, guarding of lights, which is kind of a controlled studio space where you kind of can photograph and digitize those materials, which has been used in CSSC. I have seen and experienced. And so to speak of the strategies, I think what Shamik was talking about, I think Michelle also had kind of asked about, is say for example, Perumal Roy's collection. Now, Perumal Roy's collection is a huge collection, and it has a number of other things as well. The reason I chose these specific sets of objects to suit the presentation requirement. But as Shamik said, yes, I mean, there's a sudden generation of interest in terms of ephemera, talking about that, which is important, yes. But also important factor is the dissemination of the archival collection. It's maybe through exhibition, maybe through publication or monographs, or because unless and until these ephemera or any other collection remain kind of within the interest and attention of the scholars and the academics, fraction only, and it kind of refuses to engage beyond that section. The public's, unless until you have probably an exhibition which is more because of the affective value of a certain kind, that public will come drawn towards. Like this collection there was an exhibition curated by Professor Taufik two occasions, in I think early 2009 and 2016. It was called Sitting in the Archives, which kind of took a person through the history of Calcutta, but only through these visual memories and visual photographs. That was kind of one opening into looking to the other collections, weaving the archival other collections, the textual collection also with the visual materials. So I kind of answers or touches upon a few of the points we were talking
about. Thank you, Ritwika. We have a few questions from the audience. So we have a question from Vishwajyoti Ghosh. And the question is for all three speakers. Considering ephemeral materials are cast in time and context, can you share a material or two that has stayed with you over the time and why? Taking from Siddarth's last example of what connects with you and why so. If we could start from Deepak, would you like to respond to that question, Deepak?
this first, I would go with Ritwika's one problem. I faced almost same kind of problem with morality things. When I did some interviews with the old generation who actively participated in 1950s movement, the narration of those people were different than the ephemera that they produced in 1950s. So both narration and the ephemera were telling two different stories from same people or same producer. So that may be one challenges when we are doing research in this case. So yeah, for the uh, last question, uh, yeah, time, yeah, how can, yeah, I have no, not exact the answer, but uh, I am working with, for example, if I am working with a text, then it can go 100 years back. If I'm working with a text only, I'm not thinking about the ephemeral things, but with the text only. So how text has changed over the time or the design over time, then I can uh, contextualize the time period or ephemeral things that change over time, or even design. But otherwise, maybe some issue, maybe we can link with this, some issues that come regularly. Otherwise, yeah, it is difficult to connect with the past and uh, contemporary ephemera, but some political issue may be connected. Some issues or some demand by some politician, and even some movement, maybe we can connect different kind of movement that not accomplish their uh, uh, demands, or they are doing the same kind of revolution or same kind of demands are repeating. uh, that may connect some ephemera with past and present. Yeah, for me, it is text or it is design or something like that. We can connect 100 or 200 years with contemporary ephemera. That's it. Is it okay?
Yeah, thank you, Deepak. Shamik, would you like to add to that? In the context of MPP, is like particular material that stayed with you that had like a great
Uh,
impact on you?
yes, I've just typed my answer, but let me say that as well. What amazes me is that there are several of those uh, ephemeral materials because, and I can't point out only one. And what amazes me is that for every dominant narrative one will say about Nepal, I can always produce one ephemera that will counter it. So that is the strength, If somebody says, there is this dominant narrative that until before 1950, Nepal was a closed nation, then I will produce an ephemera that says, okay, it was not as closed as the narrative says. Similarly, if you say that the social justice issues were raised, say in the 1960s, I'll produce one from before, from 1930s that will say, okay, uh, not exactly. So things have happened before as well. So that is what excites me, and there are too numerous to mention only a few. So
Thank you, Shamik. Ritvika, maybe you could respond to that.
Yeah, it's difficult to pick one because there are many and many because of so many different reasons altogether. Um, and I think instead of choosing one, probably certain category of images, especially in terms of like I think Deepak showed one of those political graffitis on the walls. and it is something that how do you like kind of categorize it or have a physical presence unless until convert to a digital medium. So there is a similar collection in the archives of a collective of photographers from Calcutta called Chitrobani, which is a series of the political graffitis during the 70s, 60s. And those are kind of the most kind of alive kind of photographs, in the sense you cannot really document a political graffiti. You cannot take the wall and keep it somewhere. So that is probably one of the most one of the thing I can say I do remember, because it has an effect on you. And I still remember being a young professional, when I first saw that collection, that was pretty overwhelming, because you do not, and these are not like really public, like not out in the public. So that kind of representation of those times you do not come across in so much of books or images that is in circulation right now. So maybe that one.
Yeah, thank you, Ritwika. Siddarth, would you like to add to that? You already kind of touched upon it, but if you would like to see something more.
There have been many examples at Kamra that have stayed with me, and for very many reasons. But the one thing I will present to you now is, so in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was this long Yahoo mailing list called LGBT India with people from across the world. And so when the different events and the politics and like the protests were happening, and then when finally in 2009, the Delhi High Court decriminalized 377 for the first time, and all of that was happening, there were these Indian people living across the world sending emails, speaking with each other, sharing news, sharing sorrow, sharing joy for the different things. And at Kamra, we have a printout of around 3 months of those communications, which forms a stack around this thick, just 3 months. But what has happened, it's already survived for around 20, 30 years as a printout on one of those old dot matrix printers, and the ink has almost faded away, making them even more kind of ephemeral. Not only were these messages just electronically sent, never meant to be printed out in the first place, but once they have been printed out, they've almost disappeared from the paper they were printed on. But what we did learn was that a university in California has backed up the entire LGBT India Yahoo lists mailing conversations. So we will try to access and get a copy of that at the archive. But this materiality and the very nature of the communication is something that has stayed with me.
Thank you, Siddarth. We have one more question from the audience. Sumitra Sundar asked this question particularly addressed to Ritwika.
I think I just in that, but it's fine. I can answer that.
So Sumitra is curious to know about the definition of ephemera that you have located in your presentation. She would like to know a little more about how the binaries of precious objects versus ephemera happen.
So the definition of ephemera is to the original character, how it was defined. That is what I've kind of tried in my presentation with. Now, the term precious object, I think I have used in terms of defining Porimal Roy's collecting practices, because he has been collecting coins and a lot of other things, which are, so to say, precious objects. Why? But I do not intend to use it as binary categories. But if it came across, I'll like clear that. Why? The reason being, I wanted to see from the perspective of a collecting practices, like how a collector, what impulses informs his practice and act of collecting. And that has evolved over time, and it kind of, not exactly evolved, but that kind of exists parallelly. There have been older kind of collections that we all see in private museums and in auction houses. Those were kind of a representation of a certain self-fashioning, a certain that speaks of a certain affluence, having which the one could focus on. But vis-a that, and I use ephemera in this presentation to demarcate or rather distinguish between the impulses of collecting practices that kind of informs a collector like Poriba. I hope that kind of helps the time so understand the difference.
Thank you, Ritwika. I'm aware of time, but we have one more very interesting question. So I would like to extend for like 5 minutes. This question is from Renan Laruan. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Thank you for sharing your practices and positions to the ephemera and the archives. I'm curious about your experience or engagement with the ephemera that escapes familiar mediating structures, such as the old aesthetic couple form and content, say as demanded by art history or art historical impulses, or that evades use of background knowledge in more stable knowledge areas. Any instances that these ephemeral materials lead to other territories beyond the artist frontier. So I would like to all of you to kind of respond to this question. Should we start with Siddarth?
Sure. This is a very interesting question. And I think as diverse as ephemeral material are, so diverse are the different kind of territories that they lead to. Just off the top of my mind, one thing is about examining information flows within a society or across countries, for example. How did or why did that information come from there to here? And what did that information achieve in this new place? What was it doing in that previous place? How ideas of protest are informed. Also, I showed in my presentation a pamphlet about abortion rights in Seattle. But if you read that pamphlet a little closely, you would recognize a lot of the vocabulary that has been used as a vocabulary that has been used by the left radicals in the US, by the Black Panthers in the US, the kind of self-defense and we need to do this for the right of the underprivileged, the kind of words and the figures of speech used. So they allow you to trace the history of ideas through these materials, moving away from just the art and the artist frontier.
Shamik or Deepak, would any one of you would like to take this question?
Yeah, just like to add to what Siddarth just says regarding the flow of ideas. In one of the slides that Deepak showed, there was one from the 50s or early 40s, I guess, which mentions advocates for widow marriage in Hindu religion. So and it is printed in Banaras. So I can't help imagining. So it must not have been that Nepali institution that printed it. It must have been influenced by some ongoing movement, similar movement in India. So there definitely we can trace the movement of ideas as well, which readily goes beyond art and artist frontier, like it was mentioned, yeah, in the query.
Ritika, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think what Siddharth started, I'll continue in those lines because yeah, I think ephemeral material may be the predominance of what we engage with and see. We do get carried away or kind of see it in the brackets of categories of art and artists, but it's also it's a communication tool at the end of the day as well. And if I recall, I have not shown that in the presentation, but there are few of these materials in the archives, which are kind of public messaging service, and it's not a government public messaging service as such. These are like maybe some urban community, or they are like coming together and asking like for like civic behavior in some like do not defecate these walls or maintain and there was one around vaccination which I wanted to include in this presentation given this times, but what I wanted to say, yes, I mean it's also a tool of communication, so definitely it goes beyond the creative aspect of only art and artists, and we should look into that like through that lens as well.
Thank you, Ritwika. Deepak, would you like to add any points to that?
Only one point I would like to add. Yeah, it is not about the art or history, art history, but about the content that is written by whom. So I asked with some ephemera and who produced it, basically political ephemera, circulated around 1960s. So it is dominant produced or written by teachers who used to teach in school level or in college. And the interesting thing is the whole Nepalese political uh, movement is almost run by the teachers. They are the cadres and they are the local leaders and they produce the material. If we can link with this content producer with the political uh, leaders, then we can connect at least in Nepalese context. Uh, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deepak. And I'm conscious of the time. So I think on this note, we can wrap up for the day. And as we think through the fluid motion of ephemera and how it evolves and takes forms and informs the archive, a lot more questions have opened up today. And the process of understanding ephemera, I think, is not conclusive. And we can continue to define and expand the idea of ephemera. And I hope that this conversation is a starting point to further this discussion on the significance of ephemera. So thank you so much, Deepak, Shamik, Siddarth, and Ritwika for being here with us today and sharing your ideas and experiences with us so generously. And we look forward to continuing these conversations. Next in the series of Interarchives Conversations is a conversation that we are conceptualizing in collaboration with Nepal Picture Library. So please stay tuned for more on that. For our friends in Kathmandu, the Mobile Library is currently at Vikalpa Art Center in Kulcha, where we have around 600 plus books and reading materials, and you can access the catalog for the library on Librarica. Due to the pandemic situation, currently the library is closed for visitors. However, please keep a lookout on our Facebook page as well as Instagram handle for more updates. You can also read more about the project on AA's website. Before I sign off, a big thank you to the technical support team for this program, Susanna and Rebecca, who are behind the Zoom backend. A big thank you to Sharare, Samira, Sneha, and Pallavi for their inputs and support in the program. And finally, thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye for now, and hope you have a nice evening or day wherever you are.